Okay. Well, this was quite a challenge for me because Girard's works cover about a yard if you were to put all his books together. He is a big thinker and not terribly popular for various reasons that'll come out tonight, although he's having a bigger and bigger impact on various disciplines as time moves on. My fascination with the work of René Girard is more than an academic interest. Already as an undergraduate, I was searching for an interpretive key to try and make sense of the sellout of the huge majority of German Catholics and German Lutherans to Hitler's demonic form of German nationalism. This pretty much lifelong quest of mine to understand violence from a combination of religious and political perspectives continued with engagement against America's war in Vietnam and our country's racist violence toward Native and African Americans. What bothered me the most as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth was the sellout of Christianity as a whole to violence in rejecting the 300-year nonviolent stance of the early church, becoming a state religion under Emperor Constantine, and eventually embracing the violent atonement theology of Anselm, where God as Father is portrayed as demanding the blood of his son Jesus to satisfy his offended honor at human sin. I read all I could of scripture scholars and theologians who were committed to Jesus' vision and embodiment of nonviolence. I explored the worlds of literature, philosophy, and art, looking for an interpretive key to bind together these various elements, but found none. What I did find was a lot of specialists offering brilliant insights, but all of them limited to a rather narrow angle of vision, that of their own specialty. I could find no contemporary thinker big enough to put all the pieces together into a meaningful whole, such as Aristotle and Aquinas had done for philosophy, Darwin for biology, Einstein for physics, and Jung for psychology. Then I discovered the work of René Girard about 20 years ago. He dared to break out of his own specialty of literary criticism and to follow his own personal wrestling match between violence and nonviolence through the fields of anthropology, psychology, sociology, philosophy, and finally, biblical studies and theology. What is more, he dared to write using insights from all these disciplines as a non-specialist. In our age of hyper-specialization, he dared to tell the big story, the grand récit, as the French would say, as he saw it. For this, and for the fact that he dared to tell the story as a practicing Christian, he has rather often been flatly rejected in many academic circles. And this in spite of the fact that his having written more than 20 books, many of them groundbreaking, having taught at institutions like Johns Hopkins, the Sorbonne, and Stanford, and having been inducted as a member of the Académie Française, the greatest honor that can be bestowed on any French intellectual. In recent years, Girard's thought has become a strong minority opinion in the fields of literary criticism, anthropology, and psychology. His thought is gradually gaining more and more influence on mainstream, as opposed to both fundamentalist Protestant and fundamentalist Roman Catholic biblical interpretation and systematic theology. I'd like to ask a question now. And it's going to be frustrating tonight because Girard is one of those big thinkers like Jung, and we have 2 hours. I have 2 hours to try to give an overview. Well, he's not as big as Jung, but can you imagine trying to capture someone like that in 2 hours? So I'm going to be pretty ruthless in terms of keeping time, which means that the discussion is going to have to be too limited for any of our likes this evening. But I want to give you an overview because Girard's thought doesn't make sense, really, unless you see the entirety of it. And so that's our goal for tonight. But I did want to ask the question, what are some of the cons of trying to tell a big story, a big narrative, a grand récit? What are some of the negative things about trying to do that?
Superficiality.
Okay. Okay, that's a big one.
Selection bias would be another.
Yes, definitely.
From the beginning, our critical attitudes, no matter what position one is going to take, there will be an immediate, and this is any position on any subject by anyone, there will immediately be an assault from all the perspectives that say your perspective is faulty or invalid or not worth considering.
Okay. Anybody else on the cons? Okay, what would be some of the pros of trying to tell the grand récit?
I think I'm a little familiar with him. I also encountered Girard 20 years ago. And I think he does make for a grand narrative. It's all there, I think. And he reminds me very much of Jung, and I think you can do it well in the time you have.
I don't have time to really get into a comparison between Jung and Girard tonight, it's just too vast. But that's something that both thinkers obviously have in common. They are two of the big thinkers of the 20th century, and they dared to do that. Any other positive things about trying to tell the meta-narrative, the big story?
Well, the big story contextualizes whatever specificities. So it's good to have, the big picture before getting into specificity.
I like some of the satellite images when you pull the frame so far back and you can see the Earth and you can see all the lights on at night in the cities and things like that. And so I like someone that can pull the frame back really far and see a sort of overall picture and has the.
Yes, we get stuck looking at trees instead of realizing.
Yeah. And someone that's qualified, has done the homework to do it.
And usually people like who give the big picture, who are not specialists in the particular fields, give us also permission to express our voice. Validate it very often coincides with people who don't dare to speak because you're in a lack of expertise, but that validates our vision, whatever experience we have.
Yeah. And the people with the big picture give the rest of us some stuff to criticize. Okay.
Emerson said, basically speak what's true in your heart because it's going to be true in everyone's heart. And I think at that level, at the big picture, that's the case because that's where Emerson was coming from as well.
Okay. We need, especially with people like Girard, to begin at the beginning. And the beginning of any discussion of a thinker like Girard must begin with an answer to the question of if and how we can know anything outside ourselves at all.
That's assuming there is anything outside ourselves.
Okay, well, that's the problem. Two prevalent contemporary approaches to this question are positivism and phenomenalism, both of which Girard disagreed with vehemently. And we don't have time to get into all the ins and outs of those. Each of those would take many sessions in itself, but very briefly, positivism insists that only that which can be verified empirically can be said to be truly known. The positivistic approach inevitably leads to scientism, the belief that the only true knowledge is scientific knowledge. On the other hand, phenomenalism basically argues the opposite, that all knowledge is subjective, totally dependent on the observer, and that there can be no such thing as truth with a capital T. As opposed to these two extreme, mutually exclusive positions, Girard approaches truth from the standpoint of critical realism. The best description of this philosophical position that I've found comes from New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who writes, and I'd like someone to read the first handout, which is a description of what critical realism is.
This can be someone in Zoom land.
Anybody?
Well, okay. I propose a form of critical realism. This is a way of describing the process of knowing that acknowledges the reality of the thing known as something other than the knower, hence realism, while also fully acknowledging that the only access we have to this reality lies along the spiraling path of appropriate dialogue or conversation between the knower and the thing known, hence critical. This path leads to critical reflection on the products of our inquiry into reality, so that our assertions about reality acknowledge their own provisionality. Knowledge, in other words, although in principle concerning realities independent of the knower, is never itself independent of the knower.
Okay. We could spend a whole evening discussing this one quote about critical realism, but I think you can see the balancing act that critical realists are trying to do to avoid the extreme of focusing so much on a limited notion of objectivity, or going in the opposite direction and focusing on total subjectivity. There's a balance, and I guess the older I'm becoming, I'm realizing more and more the wisdom of Aristotle, who talks about the golden mean, which I think in most situations, not all, but most, is probably a better way to go than either extreme. The majority of literary critics today would not apply Wright's description of critical realism to the field of literature. The dominant approach to literary criticism in our time is that of post-structuralism, perhaps best exemplified in the French thinker Jacques Derrida. For our purposes, the crucial thing to know about post-structuralism is that it emphasizes the subjective experience of the reader and rejects the notion that literature can point to anything real outside the text itself. Post-structuralism rejects the realism in critical realism and focuses on the critical pole. As a critical realist, Girard passionately opposes this approach. So that puts him at odds immediately with the vast majority of literary critics, especially in his own homeland of France, where post-structuralism is all the rage, and that has taken over literary criticism worldwide for the most part. Now,
What,
Lisa,
just, what's his timeline? Like, when was he born? When was he working? Is he dead?
he died in 2015, so and he died in his early 90s, and so he's been around for almost a century.
Wow.
As opposed to this, a famous example of a literary text exhibiting meaning above and beyond the text itself is Heinrich Schliemann's using geographical and cultural clues in Homer's Iliad to discover the ruins of ancient Troy. Up until he did this, it was widely assumed that Troy was simply a mythical city, mythical here meaning that its existence was limited to the text. For Heinrich Schliemann, a close reading of a work of literature led him to archaeological truth. For René Girard, a close reading of literature would lead him to some startling discoveries in psychology, anthropology, and theology. Girard began his teaching career as an instructor of French literature for a year at Duke University, followed by 5 years at Bryn Mawr College. He focused on the novels of Stendhal, Flaubert, and Proust. He soon noticed that the subject of desire was of primary concern to these three authors, and that their careful examination of desire always entailed a careful examination of deceit as well. Then he saw the same interplay between desire and deceit in the novels of Cervantes and Dostoevsky. The groundwork had been laid for his first major work, the groundbreaking Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, published in French in 1961 and in English by Johns Hopkins, where he was now teaching in 1965. Deceit, Desire, and the Novel firmly established Girard's reputation both as a major voice in literary criticism and as a major contrarian scholar, a distinction which he held throughout the rest of his life. For a powerful example of how Girard finds meaning way above and beyond the text itself, let us look at how Girard considers the work of William Faulkner. During his time teaching at Duke University in North Carolina, during the academic year 1952 to 53, Girard acquired some firsthand knowledge and experience of how racism works in the United States. In fact, he took a trip with some colleagues from Duke to Alabama and experienced a very, very close encounter with direct violence there himself, directed at him and his party. They had the gall to sit down at one of those lunch counters that was limited to whites, and they felt that they were rather in danger of losing their lives. Reflecting on his experience in the American South in Souvenirs of a Young Frenchman in the United States, Girard writes, and I'd like someone to read number 2, handout number 2, David.
I'll do that. From René Girard, Souvenirs of, you can pronounce that for me. No, I'm trying to say, how do you pronounce it?
A Young Frenchman in the United States, yeah.
But as soon as summer arrived, an overwhelming heat weighed on you like a curse, provoking an anguish that was not experienced as a purely physical phenomenon, and which I could not separate in my mind from the racial malaise that always hung over this country. and remained as it had been described by the great writers of the South, especially Faulkner. I'm against the tendency of some critics to reduce everything to mere literacy constructions. This literature was great because it captured a meaning that was really there, and which haunted everything precisely because the majority of men had refused to come to grips with it.
Thank you, David. This quote gives us a beginning idea of how Girard goes about finding and utilizing literary evidence to back up his championing of mimetic theory. A further quote provides a good description of the methodology Girard used to come up with his most celebrated insight. And I'd like at this point to ask someone to read number 3.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, that'd be handout number 3.
Here?
Yes, right there.
I discovered that great novelists had all these converging insights into the mimetic theory, and in a way, only they could have this, because they were systematically interested in human relations.
Okay. Oh, it continues. The italics.
In analyzing a text, one cannot just reuse the same analytical approach that worked with another text. Writers are always different in their coping with mimetic mechanism. Every writer is part of a history that is both collective and individual. The possible mimetic combinations are enormous in number, as are the ways to express them. One cannot map out the way mimesis works with writers in general. Each one demands an entirely different demonstration, although a critic who is interested in the mimetic mechanism knows that ultimately he or she will unveil the same mimetic principles. This variety posits a fascinating case for the mimetic theory. If writers are also different, and yet the same fundamental principles can be identified in their works, then this could be considered as strong, indirect evidence of the viability of the mimetic hypothesis.
Thank you.
Does everybody understand what he means by, are you gonna get into what mimetic means?
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's the next part, yeah.
Okay.
But before we get to that, I would like to ask a question. This is a really crucial quote concerning Girard's methodology, how he is able to see certain patterns in literature. And one of the fascinating things about that is that he keeps reading and reading and reading, of course, his whole life long, and he keeps finding the same patterns that occur in literature, and then he's moving eventually into reading myth and anthropology, and lo and behold, he sees the same patterns occurring there. Do you think this same reasoning can apply to myth as to literature? Do you think that methodology would hold up in both fields?
Well, there is a big thing that must strike us here in this group is that it sounds almost like archetypal. It sounds like, not knowing René Girard, when we read that quote, it's like, well, here is someone that was on the same track that Jung was when he was doing his experimentation with people and the time lapse between words and to try to identify patterns and reveal underlying structures that he later called archetypes. So it goes a lot with that, and if we take that standpoint, then yes, indeed, it makes things about mythical patterns, and it's it's the perspective that one can have here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a really critical bridge between Jung and Girard. One of the things I learned in working this out for this evening is the commonality in pattern recognition between Jung and Girard. They're geniuses at that, both of them. And there's a lot of overlap in some non-overlapping material, but there's a lot of overlap.
There's just one, you're going to move into this, and that is, I do know it's central for Girard, this notion of mimesis. And I would be interested in how that connects to this part of the conversation.
Yeah. The quote was basically a teaser. My next thing is, but what is mimetic theory or the mimetic hypothesis, according to Girard? Based on his close reading of the 5 before mentioned authors, Cervantes, Stendhal, Flaubert, Proust, and Dostoevsky, reading which soon expanded to include Shakespeare and the Greek tragedians, Girard observed that all these writers were extremely good observers of the deceptive workings of human desire. This fascinated Girard so much that he wrote concerning this early period of his work, "What I wanted to do was to write a history of desire through the reading of the great literary works." This is exactly what he achieved in Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. As its name implies, Girard intimately links desire with deceit in this book. In fact, the interplay between deceit and desire is the basis of mimetic theory. Although synonymous, Girard uses the words imitation and its Greek equivalent mimesis. So when you hear mimesis, it's kind of a scary word. It's just the Greek word meaning imitation. He uses the English and the Greek in different ways. Imitation, according to Girard, is a positive take on desire. Mimesis would be the negative take. So that would be an important distinction. What Girard saw more clearly than anyone else in his reading of many of the greatest novelists and playwrights was that they saw that our very desires are learned behaviors. He labels the contemporary conceit, he calls it a conceit, of insisting that our desires are uniquely our own, the romantic lie. A lie closely tied to the worship of autonomous individualism in the Western world. We've probably all noticed 2 toddlers playing when one suddenly desperately wants the toy that the other toddler has simply because he or she has it. Or how advertising is all about teaching us to desire certain things so intensely that we just have to have them. Girard saw that the great novelists and playwrights were the greatest observers of human nature, and that what they observed is that much of our desire is mediated, comes to us from others. It does not have its origin in us, but in the desire of the other. N drives a BMW. I desire a BMW. N is in a romantic relationship with so-and-so. Therefore, I desire so-and-so as well. N is everything that I would like to be. Thus, I want to be N. Girard maintained that the work of a truly great author, if not literally, was at least metaphorically autobiographical. According to Girard, the literary critic, one thing that all outstanding writers have in common is that their work gradually deepens over time. It evolves. It becomes deeper, more profound in terms of an in-depth understanding of human nature. Girard saw that this is so because the greatest authors have come to recognize the mediated nature of their own desire and have had to face and wrestle with their own jealousy, rivalry, resentment, and inner violence. Girard maintained that the world of great literature was a microcosm of the world as a whole. In other words, the jealousies, the rivalries, the resentments, and the violence reflected in literature were indicative of the macrocosm of the world. But before Girard could bridge the gap between microcosm and macrocosm, something beyond either would have to take place for him. As he was writing the final chapter of Deceit, Desire in the novel in the fall of 1958 and the winter of 1959, he realized that the disordered desires written about in the works he was analyzing were not just the disordered desires of the literary characters or their authors or the world at large. They were his own disordered desires as well. Specifically concerning this time, Girard writes, I was thinking about the analogies between religious experience and the experience of a novelist who discovers that he's been consistently lying for the benefit of his ego, which in fact is made up of nothing but 1,000 lies that have accumulated over a long period, sometimes built up over an entire lifetime. Years later, looking back at what happened, Girard describes a conversion in which you accept that you are part of the mimetic mechanism which rules human relationships, in which the observer acknowledges the fact that he himself is implicated in his own observation. Not only were the disordered desires portrayed in these novels his, Girard realized that he had the same yearning for wholeness and that the possibility of transforming destructive desires into constructive ones might also be his as well. Especially in reading Dostoevsky, Girard too became convinced that only a relationship with a transcendent being could empower him to transcend his own disordered desires. Concerning the writing of Deceit, Desire in the novel, Girard tells us, I started working on that book very much in the demystification mode, cynical, destructive, very much in the spirit of the atheistic intellectuals of that time. He may have started the book that way, but by the time he finished it, he was a changed man. He writes, it was my work that oriented me toward Christianity and convinced me of its truth. It is not because I'm Christian that I think as I do. It is because of my research that I became a Christian. And of course, his research is literature to begin with. Girard himself does not hesitate to use the word conversion to describe his experience, and it contained both intellectual and emotional elements. Looking back over the entire trajectory of his work, Girard writes shortly before his death in 2015, everything came to me at once in 1959. I felt that there was a sort of mass that I've penetrated into little by little. Everything was there at the beginning, altogether. This frustratingly brief description is all that he gives us in terms of the content of his conversion. In one of his last books, Girard claims that conversion is a form of intelligence, of understanding. This remark is heavy with implications. To me, it suggests that the everything that came to him at once was a unique ability to recognize a particular pattern of violence through several different disciplines. He discovered this pattern through a close reading of literature. This pattern recognition soon spilled over into recognizing similar patterns of violence in myth, sacrifice, ritual, scapegoating, and religion, which led him to some groundbreaking work in the field of anthropology. A colleague, Sandor Goodhart, comments, "The reading of culture through literature led him to the reading of culture through Greek tragedy. The reading of culture through Greek tragedy led him to the reading of culture through anthropology." Greek tragedy is riddled with myth, and myth is a form of literature. Girard's encounter with myth and Greek tragedy sparked in him a keen interest in myth in general, which in turn led to several years of intense reading in anthropology. What began as an interest in specifically Western mythology soon expanded to include world mythology. Soon Girard was looking at myths from India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and the South Pacific. Before long, he was seeing similar patterns of violence across the board. He systematized his insights in his second groundbreaking book, Violence in the Sacred, published in French in 1972 and in English in 1977. Cynthia Haven, who wrote Girard's biography, which she named Evolution of Desire, remarks, "He studied human behavior as reflected in the greatest works of literature and found in them a recurring analytical observation of the serious consequences of mimetic behavior. This discovery opened his eyes to the hidden dynamic of group violence." As Girard's engagement with literature expanded to include mythological literature as presented by the ancient Greek tragedians Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, he began noticing the same mimetic patterns as he had in reading the much more recent literary form of the novel. This further confirmed his thesis that great writers of different literary genres from very different times and places saw and described the same dynamics of human behavior, and that these dynamics were inevitably and invariably mimetic in nature. In his extensive reading of anthropology, he soon came to see that myths purporting to tell the origin of a particular people or custom, and myths revealing hidden identity were essentially telling and retelling the same story. This story was one of mimetic desire growing into mimetic rivalry, which in turn expanded into a full-blown mimetic crisis, a crisis which was suddenly resolved through the sacrifice of an appropriate scapegoat. Let's look at this four-step process in more detail, since it provides the basis of Girard's philosophical anthropology, his answer to the question of what it means to be human. His years of studying literature, then anthropology, enabled him to extend his understanding of mimesis all the way back to the formidable topic of human origins. Just as Girard flatly rejected the dominant school of literary criticism in our day, which argues that a text can have no reference outside of the text itself, Girard flatly rejected the dominant school of anthropology in our day, which assumes that the details of human origins are unknowable. Girard maintains that he found enough substantive clues in great literary texts, like Dostoevsky's The Possessed, Crime and Punishment, and the Brothers Karamazov, to argue that the text not only refers to the author's personal transformation of desire, but also challenges us as readers to engage in the transformation of our own desire. In a similar way, Girard maintains that he has found enough substantive clues in the worldwide myths of human origin and identity to argue that the broad outline of human origins is knowable. Girard founds his mimetic theory on human desire, which his vast amount of reading in various disciplines gives him plenty of evidence to claim that desire, far from being an independent expression of an autonomous subject, is learned or imitative behavior. In other words, desire, according to Girard, is contagious. Applying this insight to human origins, Girard posits that in a time before ritual and law had developed into mechanisms for regulating mimetic behavior, mimetic desire, say for the same hunting territory or the same sexual partner, often led to mimetic rivalry, competition among rivals for the same partner or the same hunting territory. Mimetic rivalry, unchecked as yet by ritual and law, often escalated into a full-blown mimetic crisis, with an entire group in conflict with one another over wanting the same things. Left unchecked, a mimetic crisis always led to the self-destruction of a group of early humans. Through his extensive reading of myths of human origin and identity, Girard was comfortable in claiming that he had found enough clues to detect the mechanism through which a group was saved from self-destruction. This is what Girard called the scapegoat mechanism. The scapegoat mechanism or resolution is the second of Girard's major discoveries and flows from his first, his finding that desire is imitative or mimetic in nature. Girard studied hundreds of myths of origin identity from all over the world. He saw that these myths held much in common. One, the society that the myth described was in danger of disintegrating. Two, the out-of-control mimetic rivalry of the group as a whole gradually became focused in a laser-like way on one individual who was in some way considered to be marginal, a foreigner, a woman, usually single, a person with a disability, someone with no ability to retaliate. Three, the group as a whole proceeds to sacrifice the person chosen as the scapegoat. The sacrifice is performed in such a way, usually by stoning or crowding the sacrificial victim over a cliff, that no one is directly responsible for the scapegoat's death. Four, the tsunami of violence directed at the scapegoat and resulting in the scapegoat's death succeeds in dissipating the mimetic crisis, and peace is restored. And five, the community interprets this peace as a gift from the scapegoat, who is often then deified. This, in a nutshell, is the foundation of Girard's philosophical anthropology. he offers it to our contemporary world as a way of understanding who we are and where we've come from, in the hope that this knowledge will give us the tools we need to better chart the course of our evolution in the future. According to many, no other contemporary thinker has more seamlessly bridged the gap between Charles Darwin's biological understanding of human evolution and the parallel and complementary understanding of human evolution based on the social sciences. For this, Girard has been dubbed by some as, quote, the new Darwin of the human sciences. The biological implications of Darwin's survival of the fittest are masterfully echoed in Girard's literary, anthropological, psychological, and finally theological implications of this very concept. What does survival of the fittest look like in terms of the human sciences? It looks like mimetic desire escalating into mimetic rivalry, exploding into mimetic crisis, and finally being resolved by the limiting violence of sacrificing a scapegoat. If it is indeed the case that Girard's analysis of human cultural evolution mirrors Darwin's analysis of human biological evolution, one would expect to find some concrete links between the two. And this next part is really important because it, at least in my own understanding, it's the first concrete evidence of a bridge between the biological science of evolution and the sociological understanding of evolution. Two Italian scientists, followers of Girard, set about and succeeded in finding just such a link with their discovery of mirror neurons in the mid-90s. Mirror neurons are particles in the human brain whose function is to enable imitative behavior. So these were two students, followers of Girard. They were also scientists. So they realized that if Girard is correct, there should be an observable biological link between what he says and what Darwin says. And lo and behold, at the University of Padua in Italy, they were able to discover just such a neuron in the brain that enables imitative behavior. Based on this foundation of mimesis and scapegoating, Girard formulated his controversial theory of cultural evolution. And that's this, and we're not going to like it very much. I remember how much I disliked it when I first came across it.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Why does the death of the scapegoat dissipate the crisis, or is there no answer to that? It's just, that's what happens?
I think he would argue from his study of myth that there is a similar pattern in almost all the myths of sacrifice. And that pattern is that when the sacrifice is accomplished, peace is restored. We're going to look at one such myth.
I know, I just wonder why.
Is there a single link with what comes to my mind is almost an image of let's say literally of mirrors, like real mirrors, and I would imagine like this game where people say within a group, oh no, he wanted it, and the other one say no, he wanted it, and so forth, until all the echoes of this little sentence, like images, mirrors, focus on a single one and kind of like congeal on, oh, well, initially, I mean, and all the time, he wanted it, and this last he is the scapegoat. Is it something like that?
I think that's a very good picture of a very good way of understanding it.
I want to say about that Jesus was the example that he used in one of his many examples, but Jesus, in the sense, was offering himself as the victim. And then through his offering, then the society could be healed, and also he could become the healing God, the good God that was originally the bad God. And then through his sacrifice, he became the true God.
One of the things that is quoted in some of the books there were a number of examples in some of the books that I read of people, for example, in South Africa, when things were at their worst there. They discovered Girard's writings, and they talk about finally discovering somebody who understood what they were going through with the scapegoating. And I guess there's no real answer to why this happens, but it seems to work. It has seemed to work from the very beginning of time, so to speak, and it's still working today. Who knows why?
Yeah.
Ashwin's had his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe the etymology of the words might be helpful here. Sacrifice, as the word suggests, it's like to make something sacred. So the entity that is sacrificed, as a scapegoat, it's a ritual offering to whatever theological system exists at that point. So you have this tension that builds up because something doesn't fit in, and to resolve the tension, and sort of escape the tension, right, which is the escape part of scapegoat, you take some suitable scapegoat and you sacrifice them. Actually, what I'm more curious about is why it fails to work. Like, for example, in the racial context, or in the context of demonizing a certain group, the demonizing is happening, and yet the scapegoat function doesn't seem to be quite fulfilling itself, in the sense that there's a continual sort of antagonism, and it doesn't resolve, or the tension doesn't get resolved. And I'd be curious what your thoughts on why that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I had that same question with regard to, and I think this might be where you're coming from, Ashwin. Correct me if I'm wrong, but with politics today, there's a lot of scapegoating going on. My hypothesis is that it's not working because it's not directed enough. It's at a whole group instead of an individual, and the group cannot be killed to satisfy the redemptive capacity of scapegoating. You put your sins into the goat, you sacrifice the goat, and therefore your sins are gone. If the goat doesn't die, or the person doesn't die, or the other group doesn't go away, your sins don't go away.
I think that's definitely one of the things that's going on, David.
And another thing is, there has to be a forgetting. There has to be a period in which you forgot, the culture, whatever that, has forgotten why. And so you can't raise that sacrifice, that scapegoat to a god, unless you've forgotten the original reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said it in the mechanism points. No one has to feel responsible for it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's key.
I think, well, one of the things that Girard talks about in many of his later works is how uh, especially with Christianity in Western culture, Christ has become such an archetype, let's say, so foundational that the word victim, I'd say beginning with him in the most profound sense, has become a positive word. So he traces this development of people being able to recognize victims and their innocence from the time of Jesus all the way through the last 2,000 years, and discovers that everybody is claiming to be a victim today. Well, I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia was the victim. It's like one of the great things that was accomplished in Jesus was showing the innocence of the victim in many cases. But one of the sad things about that is that everybody claims to be a victim today. Russia's a victim. The whites are victims of the, black hatred and everybody's a victim. And so no one's a victim. It's taken a lot of the meaning out of it. So there are some very complicated dynamics at work that has dissipated, I think, some of the original power. Let's say, if we read the Gospels and read the account of Jesus' sacrificial death and victimization there, that power has been dissipated dramatically throughout the last 2,000 years. And several people have mentioned this, scapegoating just doesn't work today. It worked in early human culture as stopping the violence. It doesn't work anymore for the most part as a stop to violence. So Girard himself says we have gotten ourselves in an extremely tenuous, difficult position, because what used to work in our evolution, and it used to work very well, no longer works for us. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I think he has some proposed answers to that. But I'm glad these questions have come up, because they're so real and relevant to what's going on today. What's going on not just between Russia and Ukraine, but in our own culture. Everybody's a victim.
But what he says, though, is that in more advanced societies, you no longer needed that victim because you had the law. So the law would accept the victim, the one victim or whoever that group of victims, and put the law upon them. So in this sense, it was a sacrifice, but it was controlled, and society accepted that. And I guess what you're talking about now is that society doesn't so much accept the rule of law as a substitute for what was going on before.
I think what we're seeing today is a rather total breakdown of institutions that used to work, including law, including scapegoating, including ritual, including religion, including democracy, you can name it. They are no longer working.
Does Girard, since it is a kind of evolutionary theory, does he have anything to say about what might be the next phase of evolution?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
I'm not going to get into that. That's going to be the next big section, but yeah, definitely,
Okay.
definitely.
I mean, I would just say at this juncture, I see, portals to the psychological work. When you say, well, where did it go, and how is it working, and why is it not working, and how is this not happening in various structures? Jung would say, well, let's look into the psyche, let's look into the
Yeah.
unconscious,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
see what we find.
and that's,
I just want to offer a complication. Sorry, sorry to interrupt. I want to offer a complication because before we say that the loss of the scapegoating ability to diffuse tensions is a bad thing, you know, if I read the newspapers in
I'm not
India,
saying that, but
yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, but I mean, I'm just going to offer a perspective. Like when I read the newspapers in India, often it's full of stories that some innocent person got lynched because the whole village thought that they were responsible for some evil influence or something. And after that lynching happens, the community goes back into a state of peace and everything's okay. And so they made a typical scapegoat out of something. And so it's a very it's a very polarizing thing, because on the one hand you can see that things got peaceful afterwards. On the other hand, you can see the evil that scapegoating creates. So there's a lot of tension there.
I think Girard would totally maintain the evil of scapegoating. I mean, he saw it as a necessary stage in human evolution very, very early on, but as a very negative part of human evolution. And this is what really shocked me when I was reading Girard early on. He talks about the founding murder, that in fact Girard would go so far as to say that all of human civilization is based on a founding murder, or more accurately, founding murders all over the world.
So Cain and Abel,
Cain and Abel would be the
mythic.
basic biblical myth of that, which captures that exactly, because what's the first thing that happens after Abel is killed and Cain goes off? Cain goes off and founds a city. And the biblical text then says, and that city produced musicians, artisans, all this stuff, civilization based on murder. Romulus and Remus. We could name a lot of different.
Osiris.
Yeah. That's part of our human evolution, but it's a dead end. It's a dead end, just as a very early biblical law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which was a good thing when it was formulated because it limited violence. That sadly continues to be the most popular Bible verse for Christians in this country. That's the most popular verse. Jesus takes that on with a vengeance himself and says, no, if we're going to have a culture that is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it's going to be a culture of blind and toothless people. And that's exactly where we're headed if we go on this current path.
This is turning on cheek.
But my thought on this is that different cultures are at different places in their evolution.
Yeah.
And therefore, that myth occurs at different places in time.
Yeah.
You know, among all these cultures,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to trace
Yeah.
that out.
Yeah.
And see how that consistency works. Because if you just pick a point in time, it's going to be sort of chaos.
Yeah. I was thinking when Ashim was speaking about India, in certain places of India, scapegoating would work to stop the violence.
Even today.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, it's the rule may be valid, but you have to look at when and where.
Yeah. So different places in the world are different stages on the evolutionary cycle.
I wanted to note that, that you've taught me this, that, he sees Cain and Abel as, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, he sees that as the fall more than, the Adam and Eve story.
Yeah, so the fall for Girard would be violence, murder, way more than whatever happened between Adam and Eve. So he goes on and claims that this founding murder eventually, in very early humanity, gave rise to religion, language, myth, ritual, and law. And if you look at human evolution and realize that actually the way we have evolved is from the survival of the fittest, that's pretty violent. That whole image, when you put it that way, survival of the fittest, it's a violent image. It's a violent image. That's where we come from. We can't go into detail into all of Girard's system here, but it's easy, I think, to see how the founding murder or sacrifice would soon give rise to ritual reenactments of this originary event. Humans needed a way to repeat the efficacy of the original scapegoating event and soon invented ritual as a way of doing just that. Most people, including most people engaged in the human sciences, do not want to be reminded of humankind's violent past and violent present. So Girard's thought has not become a hit in the social sciences like Darwin's thought became a hit in biology. There has been one major exception to Girard's rather lukewarm reception: the conjoined fields of biblical interpretation and systematic theology. Beginning with his study of literature and then continuing with his research in anthropology, Girard, like most major thinkers, became famous by identifying patterns that no one had been able to see with such clarity and depth until he saw them. It was only to be expected that his reading in literature and anthropology led him to a close reading of the Bible, for the Bible is anthropology expressed through literature. And given Girard's already established track record of being able to discover patterns that no one else had seen before, this happened in his reading of the Bible as well. Parenthetically, this is a strong argument, I think, for encouraging non-specialists in various fields to have at it and pursue their own creative forms of brainstorming. Often, non-specialists are able to see the forest as well as the trees in a way that specialists are not. Girard's engagement with the Bible led him to his third major intellectual breakthrough. Building on his previous insights that A, desire is imitative or mimetic, and B,
Sorry. Whoops.
I'll mute you, Eileen.
okay.
Okay, there we go.
Okay. Building on his previous insights that desire is imitative or mimetic, and B, that mimetic desire often leads to mimetic rivalry, then on to C, a mimetic crisis that provokes a violent scapegoat resolution, Girard saw that the Judeo-Christian scriptures offered D, a way out of the vicious circle of violence that has been the determining factor in human evolution. His close reading of origin and identity myths from all around the world led him to the conclusion that civilization was built on a founding murder, or more accurately, murderers. His close reading of myth also enabled him to see that these primordial stories were largely attempts to cover up the underlying violence of the human condition. Here is an example of a typical identity myth that attempts to put a positive spin on one such founding murder. It comes from the Venda people of South Africa. And I'd like to ask someone to read handout number 4.
Do you want me to read?
Would someone like to read number 4?
Anyone at home? I can read it.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Okay. This is Python and his 2 wives, an exemplary scapegoat myth. Python, the water snake, had 2 wives. The first knew who he was, but the second wife did not know, and she was not supposed to know. In the middle of the night, she would wake up drenched. The first wife tried to protect her husband's secret, but her rival was curious, and after a good deal of spying on him, she discovered the truth. Then all the rivers dried up. The only water left was in the lake at the bottom of which the python had taken refuge. When they learned from the first wife the reason for Python's disappearance, the old men decided that a beer offering should be prepared. Divination revealed that Python desired the company of his second wife. While the men were playing the flute, the young woman entered the water carrying the beer offering in a basket. As the music grew louder, she disappeared, and the rain began to fall. The rivers filled up, and all the people rejoiced.
Okay.
Wow.
We don't have time to go into the details of this myth. Girard devotes 24 pages of mimetic analysis to this particular myth, but just seeing the way Sandra read it, she picked up on the details. You can see how it is in many ways a cover-up story. Python has 2 wives. One of them is not supposed to know who he is. She's the curious one. She keeps poking around until she finds the truth of his identity. This does not go over well. In fact, the word rival is used, even in the myth itself. I'm losing my place here. Where is it? Okay. So as soon as the second wife discovered Python's identity, the rivers dry up, the lakes dry up. It's a terrible mimetic crisis. So what do the men do in the community? The old men decide that a beer offering should be made. And guess what? They do a divination ritual, which discovers that the beer offering should involve the second wife who made the discovery of Python's identity. So she's going to become part of that offering. And all this is covered up. We're not told directly what happens. It makes it sound very innocent on maybe first reading if we're not familiar with these myths, but it isn't innocent at all. While the men were playing the flute, now I think this is interesting too. While the men were playing the flute, the young woman entered the water, carrying the beer offering in a basket. As the music grew louder, the music is there to just egg things on. She disappeared. In other words, she goes into the water and drowns. She's a scapegoat. She's put to death because she's discovered the identity of Python.
She's submerged back into the unconscious.
Yeah. In a Jungian way.
Yeah.
And that would be the difference between Jung and Girard. And I think they're both right, and they both come together here. In fact, I would say you need both of them because Girard, I think, is great with social analyses, Jung with more individual personal analyses. We need both. So that's a major work for someone in the future to try to look at both sides. And then as soon as the sacrifice is made, the rain began to fall, the rivers filled up, and all the people rejoiced. And there are literally thousands of myths around the world that would follow this exact pattern. Suffice it to say that his close reading from this and many other myths from all around the world enabled Girard to see that a universal constant in all these stories was that the scapegoat, the victim, was always considered to be guilty as charged. That was the universal constant. The scapegoat deserved what they got. At least that's the way the people doing the scapegoating presented it. Not only was the scapegoat arbitrarily chosen and murdered to provide the release from a mimetic crisis, the scapegoat, the victim, was held to be guilty and accountable for all the accusations projected onto it by the mimetic mob.
But the scapegoat in that story and the one in Genesis isn't innocent. They were both, okay, I'm not talking about Cain and Abel now, I'm talking about Eve. Okay, they were both desiring more knowledge, more consciousness. And the agreement, I suppose you could call it, the agreement between God and Adam and Eve was stay away from that knowledge. The agreement with Python and his second wife was you can't know who I am. You can't know God, which is kind of the same with Adam and Eve. So there's something about wanting to know God that is at the root. I think even is at this murderous root.
Yeah. I think you're really onto something new here, or new for me.
Okay.
And I think it makes a lot of sense.
It would be interesting to look at other myths too, and just see if this plays out elsewhere.
I think
although couldn't one say that it has to be fit into the framework that in order to sacrifice something to the gods, the offense has to be against the gods. Otherwise, why is the sacrifice appeasing the gods, right? So no matter what one does, a backwards justification will say that somehow they offended the gods in order to make the sacrifice realistic, or in order to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You can't win in that situation.
If you're the scapegoat, you can't win.
If what?
If you're the scapegoat, you can't.
Oh, definitely.
And the house always wins.
Yeah, the house always wins.
I think it is salient that gods are involved.
Yeah.
That the divine, the transcendent. I mean, and certainly this is very important with Jung. Is how this doesn't go away. We're dealing with godlike powers, at the very least. If we're not dealing with gods or God, we're dealing with godlike powers. Mm-hmm. And what is murder? Sort of an ultimate power over life and death.
Yeah.
They always come back to answer to Job.
Yeah. So Girard says that it's clear from the point of view of human evolution that this endless displacement of one's own fear and innate violence onto a scapegoated victim, if left unchecked, is going to evolve us right into extinction. Is there no way out of this evolutionary dead end for humanity? That's what you were asking before. Girard held that the Bible offers us a way out of this evolutionary impasse. And I'd like to say a few things about his understanding of the Bible. It's not exclusive. Girard felt very closely, based on his reading of a lot of literature all over the world, including the religious literature in India and China, South America, that there were beginning examples of certain dynamics that you find in the Bible, but that the Bible had the fullest dimension of coming up with an alternative to violence. But he would maintain that it's not exclusive. Like, Christianity is not the only truth on the planet. People like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Buddha, they would all share in this, but he would really come down on the side of Jesus having what he would say would be the fullness of that revelation. Okay, it needs to be stated right up front that the Bible is one of the most difficult and confusing books ever written, largely because of its multiple authors with many different points of view.
And rewritings.
Among other things, its readers have to contend with some of its authors projecting their own violence onto God, then in a move of breathtaking solipsism, claiming that to be divine revelation. The Bible is filled with seeming contradictions, again, largely because of its multiple authors and retellings. And it hasn't helped that literalists throughout the ages have insisted that everything in this book is equally inspired simply because it's in this book. Yet, as Girard points out with regard to the Hebrew scriptures, there is a strong minority report, a golden thread, if you will, that is present throughout the Old Testament as a whole. This golden thread is the revelation that the scapegoat is the innocent victim of the projection and displacement of the fear and violence of the mob that refuses to recognize its own fear and violence. Time does not permit the telling in detail of the cycle of Joseph's stories in Genesis, the laments of many of the psalmists at being unjustly accused, the entire book of Job as one long attempted scapegoat story, the voices of many of the Old Testament prophets urging their hearers to face their own fear and violence, and what are called the songs of the suffering servant, the representative of God who carries the brokenness of the world. This strong minority position in the Hebrew scriptures becomes the majority opinion in the Christian Gospels, where Jesus is portrayed as modeling his own ministry on these Old Testament precedents. According to Girard, the Bible as a whole gives us the most sustained presentation of the innocence of the victim in all of world literature. And this, according to Girard, is precisely the way out of the evolutionary dead end of endless mimetic desire, rivalry, crisis, and scapegoating. The Gospels are unanimous in presenting Jesus as a wholly innocent victim, and not just any innocent victim, but as the human face of God. If this is the case, and that's a big if for many people, if this is the case, there is simply no place, no room for humanity's fear and violence to displace themselves onto Jesus. Our projections bounce off of him and ricochet back onto us. His complete innocence and goodness bring us face to face with our own brokenness. Facing Jesus, broken humanity is faced with an existential choice: to continue its default position of endless violence, or to take the evolutionary leap by choosing to become more like him. And I would say, and this would be many more hours, but if we take a close look at what becoming more like him meant in the early church, which I tend to see as the closest representation of what Jesus was really all about, it doesn't look a whole like much of the Christianity that we see in the world today.
I'm having little light bulbs going on.
Good.
So the scapegoating move is about radical otherness, and about seeing that whoever is the scapegoat as radically other, and in some ways also as seeing God as radically other. And so when Jesus came saying, basically, I am God, they did to him what they did to other radically others. They put him on a cross and killed him. But by Jesus saying that I am God, he was, and saying, be like me, not follow me like, follow in my shadow, but you are God's too. If you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So he was taking the radical otherness of God, of other people, and saying, no, there is no radical otherness. There is only, he brought the paradox into the world of being both and.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're seeing the same evolutionary leap here, is that our evolutionary leap is to get out of otherness, because we kill it.
Yeah.
And okay, that was my.
And I think that's what Girard would say, that's what the Gospels accomplish so profoundly, is that they show that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
They show it so powerfully that it took over the history of the Western world for the last 2,000 years. I think
still haven't gotten it.
We still haven't gotten it. And largely, I think because the church blew it so badly.
Yeah.
We had those, in Christianity, we have those first 300 years of the early church really trying to follow in his footsteps and be like him. In fact,
and you can see that in a lot of the Gnostic literature.
Yeah. Some of the, one of my favorite kinds of theology is called incarnational theology, as opposed to like atonement theology, where someone like Anselm comes along and takes the church right back to Python or whatever, back to nothingness, by actually portraying God as wanting the blood of his son to be appeased for his offended honor at our sin. That is like the greatest mockery of who Jesus really was in the Gospels that I can imagine. And that is still the majority opinion in the Christian church, Protestant, Catholic, not Orthodox, today. Atonement over sacrifice. Jesus sacrificed himself. There's a big difference. Atonement means that God demands blood to be appeased. Sacrifice can be done out of love, which we see Jesus doing. God so loved the world. And the two models result in very, very different understandings of God. It's like, in the second model, it's like when Jesus sacrifices himself out of love for both God and humanity, the story of the cross becomes, there is nothing we can do as human beings that could make God love us less, because we've done the worst. There's nothing we can do that would take away God's love. That's what it's all about. Anselm takes that and reverses the whole thing. So I think there's a lot of tragic theology within the Christian tradition itself. David?
Yeah, there's an additional separation.
Yeah.
With the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox. When that split happened, then you have you have a rather dramatic gripping of the message.
You do. And even another split that I was really mortified with is the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church just going all out for Christian nationalism, a la Rus, taking Jesus' own words about giving your life. No greater love has a person than giving his life. Taking those words and applying them to the conscripts in the Russian army and saying that a plenary indulgence, in other words, all your sins are forgiven if you die fighting for Mother Russia. It's all this bullshit in the history of Christianity that makes people so disgusted with it as a religion, and it deserves it, with stuff like the Crusades and the Inquisition and all of it. But nevertheless, its founder, Jesus of Nazareth, would be as mortified and disgusted as we are with Christianity today. In working on this, I think the most important learning that I had personally was that Girard is really all about evolution. He's all about evolution. He would go so far as to say that God loves humanity so much that God stepped in to give us a way out of our own human violence. He stepped in the person of Jesus, gives us a way forward in terms of evolution, and it's a very simple way. It's called the imitation of Christ. It doesn't mean imitating him in all these doctrinal things. It means very simple things like feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, and loving your enemy. That's what converted the Roman Empire in the earliest church, is this countercultural kind of stuff. We've lost it. Christianity has by and large lost that vision today. And I sadly think that until it's able to recapture that, not very many people are going to take it very seriously.
I have a question. How did Girard feel about that? Because he went back to the Bible. He made much of the Jesus story and the sacrifice. Did he also feel that the church had been so corrupted as you feel?
One of my personal criticisms of Girard is that he does mention, I would say in passing, he does mention things like the Inquisition and the Crusades and talks about them as broken Christianity, but he talks about those things only in passing. He basically almost gives a pass to the church. And I don't think the church, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, deserves that pass. I don't think he's critical enough, personally.
Okay, thank you.
And also, I do really want to emphasize the point that it's not just about Jesus, but it's about living out acceptance of the other, welcoming the stranger is such a big thing. And when you look at the Hebrew scriptures, the single most important commandment that's repeated over and over and over again is welcoming the stranger. Stranger is just a kind of milquetoast word for alien, refugee.
Other.
Other.
Capital O.
Yeah. And some Christians are at the forefront today of the movement of rejecting the stranger. One of the things I love about Jesus himself is that when push came to shove, and a number of people in the Gospels directly asked Jesus, "What do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" That's a definite question that he gives a definite answer to. If you listen to a lot of conservative Christians, they would say you have to accept Jesus as your personal savior, admit your sinfulness, blah, 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 blah. That's not how Jesus answers that question. He simply says, love God and neighbor. That's his response to that. In the judgment scene in Matthew 25 and in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he makes the playing field even for the entire planet by saying anybody who feeds the hungry, who welcomes the stranger, any person who does that is de facto related to God. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? Everyone in need is my neighbor.
Yeah,
Anybody on the planet who loves their neighbor is in with God. It doesn't matter what religion's name you follow.
So this brings us back to mimesis and mirror neurons again.
It does?
Yeah, because it's the mirror neurons that allow us to see ourselves in the other and to see the other in ourselves.
Mhm. That's a great point, because one of the things we didn't have time to talk about tonight is many people accuse Girard of saying desire is always negative, imitation is always negative. He doesn't say that at all. He's focused on trying to describe the evolutionary out that we have. Humanity has this choice of accepting or continuing our mimetic violence and going into extinction. The mirror neurons can go either way. Girard, I think, would just say, if we try to imitate Christ, those mirror neurons are going to start firing in positive directions rather than in negative ones. And I would say, based on my own experience and struggle with trying to become a better person, this is exactly the way it works. It's hard work. to try to consistently welcome the stranger, welcome the other in one's life. It's really, really hard work, but it's work that's possible and doable.
I really like the idea that the mirror neurons don't have an ethical basis per se.
Yeah,
Because it
they're
can go both
neutral.
ways. You can just as well imitate some group you find that is extremely, you know, prejudicial towards other people, and if you just apply your mirror neurons there, you might end up the same as that. I do
Yeah.
think though that bringing it back to sort of what does it do to us when we have awareness that the authenticity of our desires is probably an illusion. Uh, what does it do to us? And I think it's a little bit of a vertigo, right? The feeling of vertigo, because all the fundamental precepts, how we live our lives, if those are somehow desires that we have copied or imitated or somehow absorbed from society, the people around us, parents, all of that, then what's the guiding principle? What's left, right? And I think that's why you mentioned in the beginning the middle path or Aristotle's mean, that somehow seems appealing here, because if we try to just take the stance that nothing matters, then there's a danger of falling into nihilism, that it's all just some imitated desire anyway, so maybe nothing matters. And that doesn't seem like the right response either, because there is something real. It's not just social constructs that we have absorbed from. There is something real. Like, for example, suffering is real. My suffering is real, and presumably then other people suffering of other people is real. So I think that there's some basis that at least I feel like we need to hold on to and not reject it as, oh, this is probably something I'm just copying from someone else.
Yeah.
I think, for me personally, the first step is to welcome the stranger within,
Yeah.
because there certainly is one there, or more.
Mhm.
And you can't welcome outside until you welcome inside.
Yeah.
I would dare to ask that question. Maybe it's going to complexify a little bit, but would there be a link in the history of culture, of Christian culture, of Western culture, and on the history of mind? Would there be a link between a more rational perspective on the world emerging through the age, and this erosion of the original message that you just depicted? And I would say that, in a way, if you think only rationally, and if cause and effect is a top priority, as you move forward with more and more and more knowledge and technique in the modern times, the religion can become basically a little bit mechanistic in its justifications. So at one point there is like, why would I welcome the stranger? What rationally would make sense for me to take that risk to welcome the stranger, for instance? And what I'm wondering about, or what I was wondering about when you were talking, is applying that to the example of Christianity, the concept of beauty, and also echoing, because we are in a Jungian group, the feeling versus thinking. And it's almost like we take the shortcut saying that we lost the sense of beauty. Maybe there is a link to the concept of grace, that we lost that part, just acting for free, just because there is an aesthetic, because it's beautiful to do so or to behave so. And not just because there is a cause and effect, because there is a rationality about taking a risk on doing something that could be a loss for the actor. So I'm wondering if there is such a link, and in a way, if that also could be linked with this the mimesis theory, and thinking about, like, is there a myth in our culture that we at one point felt endangered, that led us to do something horrible at a cultural level? And I was thinking about the destruction of nature. And to finish with this kind of thought, and maybe it complexified too much, I wonder if the current glamour and that we lend to nature, like, oh, these good things that come from nature and that we can consume in beauty products or in park that represent wilderness, and that these gifts that are given by this personification of something that we conceptualize as nature, isn't it a clue to say that, justifying the fact that we killed it, and that nature, the concept, reflects basically another, like, large-scale scapegoating? I don't know, I just went too far.
To follow up on that, we're in November now, and we're gonna be celebrating Thanksgiving in a few weeks. So what was it that had the early Native Americans welcome the Europeans when they landed here without any kind of, shall we say, religious doctrine saying it's a good thing to welcome strangers? And I think that ties into what you were just saying about nature, because I don't think the Native Americans, idolize nature in that way as a reaction to the destruction of it. I could be wrong though.
I'm really amazed at your suggesting that our broken relationship with nature is basically treating it as a meta scapegoat.
Yeah.
I think you're really on something.
Yeah.
And we press that so strongly that just having it stated is pretty mind-blowing. But it's one of those things, when stated, you can recognize the truth of it. I think another dimension, David, I should let you go first.
I have an observation. And my observation is from my alchemy work. The observation is this.
Speak up a little bit.
The observation is this. From the purpose of alchemy is to assist in the perfection of nature. And assist is the key. Now, in any operation, you arrive as at a point in which you cannot move further. And you have to give up your desire for a conclusion. You have to give up your desire for whatever it is that you are attempting to accomplish. And at that point is grace. That you are no longer, that you are not in charge of this. That there is a higher power that is assisting you in assisting nature. And today in our culture, we have the thought that we can do with nature whatever we choose. And that is part of it. That is the difficulty of changing that concept.
Yeah.
That we are not in charge. And we have to give up that, and that's there's the desire element there.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we have to give up that in order to move forward.
I think part of what both of you are talking about is relationality. And really being in relationship with another person or God or beauty changes the whole equation because it expands it exponentially, so that rather than just being stuck with logical reasoning, if we can relate to nature, and I would say even God in terms of beauty, that establishes a relationship in a totally different dimension than just our minds. I think it bridges a gap that other things cannot bridge, just like alchemy is trying to bridge a gap as well.
And you would say that's the relation with the unconscious.
Yeah.
You have to develop a relation with the unconscious.
Oh, at least with the archetypes.
Well,
yeah. Girard would say that God loves humanity so much that God personally stepped in to give us a way out of our evolutionary impasse and give us a choice to move forward. I think Jesus himself would agree that the choice doesn't just revolve around him, but it revolves around living a life like his, wherever that is to be found. And that life would include truth, beauty, goodness, all those things. And that's our choice. Are we going to choose those values, or are we going to go back to our default position of mimetic violence? And that's a pretty heavy duty choice that I think humanity is facing today.
we'll see how we do after the midterms.
Yeah.
We're at 9 o'clock, Paul, and for all of our participants, so we honor the fact that folks sign on with an understanding that we are done by 9 o'clock. That doesn't mean that we have to stop. It just means thank you very much for presenting tonight. And as I mentioned to you, I hope you will consider coming back as an option to continue this conversation later in building upon the work you've brought to us already. I mean, there are countless bridging thoughts and intuitions here with our work with the psychology. And I basically resisted jumping in continually to say, well, that would go here and that might lead there. But it would be great to have a chance to do that, to make more connections.
I think it would too. Just the last half hour we've had have opened so many channels in different directions. And many of them, at least for me, kind of radically new insights that it would really be good to explore this further.